Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm pleased to welcome Itamar Simonson to our Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Itamar is here today to discuss his book, Absolute Value. When consumers base their decisions on reviews from other users, price comparison apps, and other technologies, the current mantras about branding and loyalty are losing their relevance. Itamar is the Sebastian S. Kresge Professor of Marketing at Stanford University Graduate School of Business. His work has been featured in many publications and outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. He is recognized as one of the world's leading experts on consumer decision-making. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon. I'd like to talk today about what influences customers in the age of nearly perfect information. But before we get there, let's take a minute to review what we used to believe about consumers. In the beginning, the assumption was that consumers are generally rational, but because they often cannot assess the quality of things, marketers could influence their choices using advertising and branding and loyalty building and all the other topics that are covered in the marketing textbook. Then, about 25 years ago, it got a little more interesting. There are more and more studies that we've done and others have done, started showing that consumers often behave or make decisions that appeared irrational. In fact, that's where I spent the first 20 years of my career before I started revising my opinions. Here is an article that I published in the New York Times in 1994. So that will be 20 years ago. And I think that the title, the heading, tells you what it was about and who I thought was in control. Today, I'm only going to talk about a couple of examples of what led me to write this particular article. And so here, this is an effect first demonstrated at Duke University in the early 80s. Here's an example from one study that we did around 1990. Some consumers are asked to choose between $6 and this fairly elegant cross pen. Other consumers are asked to choose between $6, same cross pen, and another pen that most people, almost all people, find less attractive. What happens? Virtually no one chooses the Schaefer, but the share of people who select the cross pen over the $6, in other words, they're willing to pay $6 for the cross pen, significantly increases. Okay? Here is another example that we did around that time. Two microwave ovens. One is more expensive than the other and has more features. Both of them are on sale, 35% off. Now we add another one, this one, which is more expensive, but in any case, this particular Panasonic is only 10% off. Same deal. So now you got here two Panasonics. You would think that you added another Panasonic, it's probably going to steal more share from this Panasonic, but not so. Actually, this Panasonic makes this one look attractive because this is 35% off, this is only 10% off. And the big loser is the Emerson. Okay? Let me talk about another one. Well, before that, last year, we decided to replicate this effect and the effect that I'll talk about next. What we did, we showed people, did it with a doctoral student, Tali Reich at Stanford, and same deal. You know, some consumers chose between these two shredders and others chose between another one, between three, where if you look at the bottom one, it's more expensive, not as good. Okay, it's dominated, as we say. Okay, now we had two additional cells, if you will, two additional versions of this study where we told consumers, in addition to that information, we showed them the kinds of information you find on many websites such as Amazon. So we showed them some reviews, we gave them information about other options, and so on. So that would be kind of more like the information environment that we have today. The effect was gone. Okay, let me talk about another one. This is something I worked on, I call the compromise effect, worked on that in the mid-'80s, actually, as part of my doctoral dissertation. As you see here, there are two cameras, and again, one is more expensive than the other and has more features. Again, now we add another one. This one, it's more expensive, has more feature. It's not dominated. It's a very attractive. If you're into taking pictures, it's a pretty attractive camera. What happened? Quite a few people actually chose this camera. But more interestingly, more people now chose the middle option, the one that previously was just the more expensive with more features. Okay, this one. Now it was a compromise option. And many people switched to that option, and the big loser was the least expensive option. Okay? In other words, this is what I would call relative thinking. Why? Because people do not choose based on the evaluation of this individual product, whether it fits what they're looking for. They're looking at the choice set, and they take the middle one. Okay? Which means that had we shown them a different choice set, they probably would have made a different choice. Okay? Again, last year we tried to replicate this study. Same deal, different cameras, two cameras here, other consumers shown these three cameras. But again, we had two other versions where we gave them the kind of information available to consumers today. Again, in those cells where we gave them more information, where we showed them reviews, where we showed them more information about other cameras that are available, the compromise effect was gone.
They're completely gone?
What's that? Was completely, in that study, it was completely gone. I am hesitating to say it will always completely go. In fact, I'm not sure, but I think it's clearly significantly decreasing. Okay? But in this particular study, it was gone. Now, the significance of these results from last year goes well beyond the compromise effect. Why? Because as Emanuel Rosen and I call that, there is a general shift from what we call relative decision-making to absolute decision-making, where more and more consumers evaluate options individually based on the value of each option instead of in relative terms. Let's go back to 1999 and suppose you're thinking of buying this laptop. You might be, when you evaluate this laptop, you might have looked at the brand name, you might have looked at where it was made and so on. You might have used some generic rule like you get what you pay for. These are all relative assessments. Why? Because you're judging this particular product not based on its absolute merit, but relative to perhaps other products by the same brand, other products at the same price level, other products made in the same country, and so on. Now, the problem with those relative proxies is they often disappoint you. Why? Because the same brands sometimes make great products, other times they make not so great products. But increasingly, consumers don't have to rely on relative proxies, and instead, they know more and more before they make a purchase what they're going to actually get. These are some of the sources of information that are available today to consumers to evaluate each product individually or in absolute value, instead of having to rely on relative proxies. Now, if consumers can predict the absolute value of things, the losers are the proxies and the marketers that rely on those proxies. And if you think about the marketing textbook, much of that, and if you have ever taken a course in marketing, much of what we have been teaching in marketing is how to create effective quality proxies. Now, to the extent that consumers can assess the quality of things in absolute sense, then marketers will have much less influence. Let's go back here and think about the factors that influence consumers when they make purchase decisions. First, there is what we call P, everything that's stored in our head. Our prior experiences, our prior beliefs, what we know about the world, what we were born with, heritable tendencies. For example, I'm not going to talk about that today, but we've done now a couple of studies with identical twins, comparing them to fraternal twins, and we find that for reasons that we do not quite understand, the tendency to either compromise or not compromise appears to be largely heritable. But as I said, I'm not going to talk about that, but it's kind of interesting. It's one of the things that you cannot explain. So you say, okay, the best I can do is see if it replicates. And sure enough, it does, even though we tested it repeatedly across various categories, which is kind of interesting, but it may take a couple of decades before we'll understand why that's happening. So this is P, okay? The second one is M, which is the influence of marketers. So let's say marketers advertise, they try to persuade you. They use top of mind, they try to create top of mind, they use banner ads, they run promotions and so on. Then we have O, which is the influence of other people, and here I mean not just other users, not just friends, also experts, people who are demonstrating the product online and so on. So this is O. Now, if you want a summary of what has changed, largely due to the internet, is the rise of the influence of O and the decline of the influence of M. Now, I should note here that probably P, the influence of what's stored in our head from prior experience, also declined relative to O. Because if we have a lot of information at the point of purchase, we're probably less likely to retrieve information stored in memory based on prior experience. Now, this change that I talked about doesn't apply to all categories. There are many cases where people do not check reviews. There are many habitual purchases. When you go to buy milk or bread or hangers or soap, you're probably not checking reviews. And you just go to the store, and if it's at eye level or whatever, that probably will still influence you. But more and more categories fall in the O-dependent end of things, where people do check reviews. In fact, if you go on Amazon and you check the number of reviews on cosmetics products, you think this is a matter of personal taste. It's amazing how many reviews you get. much of the, or most of the, what I'll talk about for the rest of today's presentation will be about O-dependent products. Now, let me now examine in more detail some key, if you will, mantras or basic things that we've been talking about and practicing in marketing. I'll talk about branding, I'll talk about loyalty, come back to irrationality, positioning, targeting, and persuasion, and market research. Let's talk about branding. That's probably the biggest mantra of all. There's really nothing more marketing than branding. If you ask MBA students why they take marketing classes, branding has a lot to do with it. And you've all seen all those books about branding, and obviously they have a lot of valuable things to say. And many people feel very strongly about brands, and it is, despite what I'm going to say, brands will continue to have important functions. For example, in certain categories, if you care about status, brands will continue in some cases to communicate status. And there are other things where brands will still play a role. So brands are not going away. Having said that, the importance of brands as indicators of quality is going to decline, or is declining already. Because, as I said, today you can evaluate each product individually without having to rely on an umbrella brand name. Now, some people say, it's just the opposite. In fact, there's so much information out there, people get overloaded. And instead of processing all this information and getting overloaded, they just go by brand name. This argument appears to be based on the idea that consumers have just two options. Either you process all the information on the internet and so on, or you rely on brand names. Of course, in reality, consumers have many intermediate options. It's real easy to get a great deal of information about quality very quickly and very efficiently. And let me illustrate that in the category of restaurants. Chain restaurants used to have one key advantage. You knew what you're getting regardless of where you are. Whereas if you don't know an independent restaurant, you probably wouldn't know what to expect. So you just go with the chain restaurant, maybe not the greatest, but you know what you're getting. Well, that might be changing. Here is a restaurant that actually we talked to the owner, but it's called Machiavelli. I don't know if anyone here knows Machiavelli. It's apparently pretty popular. It's on Capitol Hill, 1215 Pine Street. And they got here over 400 reviews. If you go to their website, they have more than 50 pictures of various dishes. You look here at the rating distribution that's from Yelp. You want to look at select reviews. Sometimes I'm interested to find out what are those people who give it just 1 star or 2 stars, what are they concerned about? Is that relevant to me? It doesn't take that much time. And you can get as much information you like. It's not very effortful. And you get a great deal of information. Now, that means that as Yelp and other review sites penetrate the market, we should see a decline in the relative share of chain restaurants. In fact, Michael Luca, a researcher at Harvard, conducted a study where he had access to data about revenues of restaurants before and after Yelp entered the Seattle market. And what he found first was that every additional star on Yelp increases revenues for the restaurant by about 5%. More interestingly, he found that higher Yelp penetration leads to an increase in revenues for independent restaurants, but decrease of revenues for chain restaurants, which is very consistent with the idea that now with the penetration of the easy access to reviews and all those other information sources, we don't need to rely on brand names. We can evaluate each alternative on its own merit. Now, you might be concerned about fake reviews. And I'm sure those exist. However, it's not that easy as you might think. Now, if you go to a place and you see a restaurant or a product with 5 reviews, yeah, I think it's reasonable to assume that 4 out of 5 are friends and family. However, if you got many reviews, that's useful information. Furthermore, all those websites that rely on reviews have a great incentive to make them credible and to find. And different companies have done it in different ways. Expedia and Angie's List are, if you will, the most strict. And there are trade-offs here. On the one hand, you can be the most strict, like on Angie's List, to submit a review, you have to show, they can check whether you actually bought the product from the supplier that you're evaluating. Okay? Which is kind of, that's Amazon, for example, doesn't do it, Yelp doesn't do it, and many others don't do it. And I think their reasoning is that if that's what you do, you're discouraging people from submitting reviews, from writing reviews. Other people do other things, some people, some companies try to filter suspicious reviews. And by the way, companies and people have developed pretty sophisticated algorithms for detecting, fake or suspicious reviews. There are sting operations where they would approach companies and offer to sell them favorable reviews. There's some legal actions. Actually, there was a recent interesting case where someone, I believe in Virginia, a carpet cleaning service, sued some people who posted negative reviews of his carpet cleaning service. Turns out they never actually used his services. It was, I don't know if they were competitors, but they must have had some ulterior motives. Now, the defendants in that case said, well, that's the first covered by the First Amendment. The court, just a few weeks ago, said, no, that's not the case. If you write a false review, then you can be sued for defamation. I'm not an attorney, but you can be sued. Now, you may ask yourself, what's Yelp's position on this case? Okay, because you could see them going both ways. On the one hand, I'm sure they are concerned about fake reviews. On the other hand, they don't want to discourage people from submitting reviews because the next day they get sued. In this case, my understanding is, just from reading the press, is that they were on the side of the defendants. And I think right now it might be on appeal. In any case, issues of fake reviews is still a problem. I think it's not as big a problem as people suspect. And I think, in the near future, it will become much less of a problem than it might be today. Now, what are the implications of the fact that brand names become less important in consumers' purchase decisions? We talked with the CEO of ASUS, Johnny Shi, and he said when he decided to sell, as you may know, ASUS used to make components for other computer and other manufacturers. So he was a kind of what we call OEM supplier. When he decided to sell his products under the ASUS name, people told him, "Nah, you have no chance. You have no brand recognition. You need to spend a lot of money on advertising." Well, by 2012, ASUS was among the top 5 in the world in tablets, in laptops. They've done very well. I think the breakthrough product they had is called EPC. They just started selling it at a very reasonable price. The word got out. They got good reviews, and they've done really well. That also applies to unknown names in new categories. As you may know, Roku is extremely successful with its streaming player, with very loyal. If you go on Amazon, I think they have something like over 5,000 reviews, average of 4.5 stars. We've heard recently about Nest. These were unfamiliar names that have done very well. So that means that if brand names become less important, then the entry barrier in terms of name recognition is much lower than it used to be, as long as you have the right product, as long as you offer what we call absolute value. Another implication is that it's easier to diversify, to enter new categories under the same name. We used to teach in marketing classes that each brand is associated with certain perceived skills. Now, if you take the same name and you try to enter a different category, you will not be successful because consumers associate your name just with this particular industry. That's no longer true. If you look on Samsung or various other products, including Microsoft, as long as you offer value, you can enter almost any category. Let's talk about loyalty, another kind of favorite topic of marketing courses and textbooks. I mean, how many times we've explained to people the importance of building loyalty, and there are all kinds of quantitative calculations. If you increase loyalty by 1% and you plug it into lifetime value calculations, it turns out it makes unbelievable impact on long-term profitability. Well, if each product is evaluated on its own merit, loyalty may be not as impactful as it used to be. I may really like my car, but the next time I'm buying a car, I'm just going to look around, see what people are saying, and decide accordingly. It doesn't mean I don't like my current car, but when I'm about to buy a new car, I'm just going to look around. Loyalty becomes a little less important than it used to be. It's not past experience to determine, it's what you are offering today. This is just from one particular study done by Deloitte. They found recently that percentage of guests consistently staying at the same hotel brand is only 8%, but it applies to many different categories. So the implication is that your success depends on each product, and you're familiar with Nokia, and you look at BlackBerry. I mean, Nokia was the brand in mobile phones, and they just at some point stopped offering the smartphones that consumers were looking for. On the bright side, there are better second chances, which means that if your next product is great, that will be, consumers will forget your previous failures and evaluate your current product. Now, given all the talk about the importance of loyalty, and I don't want to downplay it, it used to be very important in a world in which consumers relied on quality proxies and on past experience. So there are all kinds of measures. There's something called Net Promoter Score that you might be familiar with. It was extremely powerful, and like how many people said they would, whatever the measure is, like 5-point or 7-point scale about how likely you are to recommend the product to others. Well, I'm not so sure you need to spend so much time on this Net Promoter Score. Or you got in market research, we spend so much time on measures of brands, brand equity, and branding. Things are changing. It depends. You may have your brand may be associated with certain perceptions today. If your next product is not so great, your great Net Promoter scores are not going to help you. Let's come back to irrationality. And as I said, for many years, we are preaching the fact that consumers are often irrational. People just didn't believe us. Well, recently, thanks to some popular books, it's become widely accepted that consumers are irrational. Now, many people believe that most consumers are irrational most of the time. Well, it's interesting because just as this belief in consumer irrationality has caught on, it's becoming a little less true. Not because consumers are smarter today or they started taking courses in rational decision making, but simply because of the information environment where you can evaluate the quality of each product. You don't have to rely on all those things that caused you to behave in ways that we and economists regarded as irrational. Let's talk a little bit about positioning, targeting, and persuasion. Again, if you've taken any marketing class, you know that what you need to do, you first decide on positioning, how you want your product to be perceived relative to your competitors. And the reason that positioning was seen as so important is that based on your position, positioning was impacting the perceptions of consumers, and all the components of marketing strategy had to be derived from your overall positioning strategy. But in a world in which you, the marketer, have less influence on consumers' perceptions, and they're more likely to rely on what I called earlier O, on what others are saying, experts and users and so on, perhaps what marketers want in terms of positioning has less and less influence. Here is an example. It was taken from, this is, I think, an ad for an HTC phone. I think it was called Status. And was introduced, and they were trying to position it as the Facebook phone. Well, didn't work out. People looked at this phone, regardless of position, they evaluated it on its own merit, based on the normal ways in which they evaluate mobile phones. And on those dimensions, it was not particularly attractive, did not do very well. So they might have thought, well, we kind of cornered the market for Facebook phone. It just didn't work out. Let's talk about other phones. And you may know the guy here on the right. Let's start with that. As you probably know, Microsoft was the first company, as far as I know, that introduced the tablet PC, I think, well before the iPad. I think it was around 2002. It was regarded, from what I could tell, as a good product. And I'm not, and maybe obviously there might have been there were probably multiple reasons why the product didn't do as well as the iPad ended up doing. But one thing that I do know is that Microsoft decided to target the tablet PC to very well-defined segments. I believe it was healthcare was one of the target segments. So they didn't go after the entire market and let the market sort it out, but instead they focused on some vertical segments. And that didn't work out. Whereas I think the iPad did not have such well-defined targeting strategy. They let the market figure out who is interested in that. And perhaps a simpler example of that is if you got this actually photo, from what I could tell from where I got it, is people who are, those seniors are actually using an Xbox, you'll be glad to know. But I think Wii was when Wii was introduced, the Nintendo Wii, I don't think they expected the seniors to be among the key segments. I don't think that was planned. And I'm pretty sure they didn't do any market research to figure out if motion-sensitive remote is something attractive. It just someone came up with that idea. Turns out people really like that. But putting that aside, turns out there is a hidden segment that they were not aware of. Okay? Again, it's very hard to predict which customers will use the product. And marketers should recognize that they cannot plan and they cannot direct consumers in certain segments to use the product. If you will, it's kind of more democratic. They have less influence, but it's, the market will discover, who needs the product, if hopefully some do. Another thing I just want to mention is, we've talked a lot about the importance of creating top-of-mind awareness. So if you see Sony all the time, when you go to the store and you want to, buy something, you say, oh, okay, Sony top of mind, I'll take Sony. Well, again, how do you buy today products like that? You're probably going, it's very easy to gather information, to go on the internet, to check reviews, to get a lot of information. Top of mind becomes less important because it's so easy at the point of purchase to gather information and assess quality. You're much less influenced by what happens to be top of mind. Just to summarize these sections, the positioning targeting works best when consumers relied on marketers. But today, this has changed. I mean, this notion that marketers can convince consumers that their products are of the highest quality, just not working as effectively as it used to be. Consumers are checking quality from other sources. Doesn't mean you should not generate interest in your product. It doesn't mean that you should not inform the market, allow people who create those reviews have all the information about your product. That's definitely important. You want to get the word out. But explaining why your product is better and more useful, and so on, or more reliable, that's much less effective than it used to be. Let's talk finally about market research. Now, if you think about what market research is about, much of that has to do with measuring consumers' stable preferences, and based on that, trying to predict what they will buy in the future. Okay, if you've ever used techniques like conjoint analysis or various other things, you're measuring the utility functions or you're measuring the prior preferences of consumers, and you're thinking that if you can measure it very accurately, you can tell what product they'll buy next year. So if you give customers exactly what they said they want, you'll be successful. Well, how do you buy those kind of products in reality today? Well, P, as I said earlier, is becoming less important. At the point of purchase, you're going to find out what people are saying about the products currently available. And if it turns out that certain features are particularly important, that will influence your current preferences. And therefore, and I should note, it was this notion for truly new products, the notion that you can measure people's preferences about new ideas was always highly suspect, because consumers are remarkably bad at predicting how they will respond to things they're not used to, because they tend to think that whatever they like now, they probably will like in the future, not recognizing that things will change. But this is becoming much less so. I mean, there is an example that you might have seen before. Often people like to cite that, some study by well-known research company about once the iPhone was announced, they came up with the conclusion that iPhone may be okay for developing countries, will not be successful in developed countries. Yeah.
I'm curious.
I'll tell you later. One of the largest, there's media conglomerates, but you should excuse them. So it's not easy, but they figure out that iPhone is just not going to make it in places like America. So they measured P. Consumers were influenced by all kinds of things, but in part O, which means that measuring P, loyalty, brand perceptions, it's becoming less important and something that marketing researchers should spend less time on. Of course, if you're selling something like toothbrush and you want to find out whether purple is going to be more popular than red, sure, market research will still be helpful. But for many products, including those that you tend to be involved in, it's not very effective. Much more important to track O and be responsive. Another thing that I know you do and many other companies do is take advantage of the fact that it's become so easy to conduct experiments with the real thing. Run experiments. Let's say that you have a search engine, let's call it Bing, and you want to find out whether arranging presenting the results in a certain way will have certain effects. That's very easy to experiment with. Experiment, look at the results, run another experiment, and continue. That's much more effective. Much more effective. So let's just summarize. I guess the overarching thing we're talking about is the shift from relative to absolute value-based decisions, which has implications. I didn't talk about everything, but I think pretty much the entire marketing textbook and marketing principles needs to be re-examined. I'm not saying, as I said, brands are gone or that loyalty is totally not important, but they're becoming less important, significantly so, and need to be re-examined. So we talk about branding, loyalty, irrationality, positioning, targeting, and persuasion, and market research. So now consumers are more likely to evaluate things based on absolute value, which means that proxies are losing their impact and marketers are becoming less influential. They need to recognize the changes and do a good job of tracking, responding quickly, experimenting. Let me end with that and open it for questions. Yeah? Did you have your hand up? No. Yes.
So this is very valid for B2C marketing. What about B2B marketing? Do you have any opinion? Did you look a bit in that field?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I even used to teach that class at Stanford for a couple of years. I usually taught the marketing core, which is kind of the basic marketing class. I think it applies to B2B as well. Now, you might say that with B2B, the customers have always been pretty sophisticated. And in many cases, they have their technical staff could evaluate products based on its absolute value in before. So in that regard, the significance of the change is not as much. I mean, they are ahead of the C, okay, of the consumer. So that is that's correct. I think even there, I think that and obviously brand name. I mean, if you talk about B2B, you talk about relationships. You talk about individual, the people that you're dealing with, your account executives, and so on. There are differences, but I think that changes, and their ability to gather information and to know in advance, that's also happening there. But I agree that it's even more important in the B2C market. Yeah.
So you talked about a lot of things that are kind of invalid. Okay, so a lot of things that are invalid, right, that were previously taken as like core tenets of marketing. So from these changes now, like what do you draw to replace that? So what is the value now of marketing, and what should be the goal?
That's a good question. And I hesitate to say this, and I think marketing has a lot of important things. I think overall, if I could say that, it's kind of dangerous to generalize too much. I think the marketing function will become a little less important than it used to be. Because much of marketing, and I hope there aren't too many marketing people here, but I think that much of marketing had to do with the creation of those quality proxies. I mean, the thing that marketers could do better than others was, they knew all this brand leadership and brand this and brand that. Okay, and no one else knew. So that was something like magic. And they probably were familiar with value pricing and those kind of things. As I said, marketers now, PR is still very important. And I think that marketers, as I said, should be able and have become really good at tracking consumer response in real time and responding very quickly. Okay, so I think that is very important. Experimentation is important. Creating awareness. I'm not talking here about persuasion. Creating awareness, that's marketing. And some of the other things that we used to do, they're not going away. As I said, brands still have a function. I don't want to take it too far, but I think if you're looking for an overall statement, yeah, I think that the marketing function is becoming a little less important than it used to be. Yes.
Any predictions about ad-funded business models? So we see some companies really deriving a lot of their revenue and profit from advertising. Are those companies at risk?
What kind of companies do you have in mind?
Take, for example, a Google or a Facebook, or even a WhatsApp, acquisition.
I think that if you look at search engine advertising, I think that will continue to be effective. I mean, I don't know what's the click rate on, let's say it's 2%, whereas banner ads might be, 0.1% in terms of click rate. I don't know the exact numbers. Okay? What's that? Accurate. Okay, maybe accurate, but whatever. What I mean is, when you search for something, that's the moment, in many cases, where you are about to make a decision. Therefore, search engine advertising, that's likely to be continue to be effective. Compare that to other companies that just you were looking for, let's say you want to communicate with your friends, and on the side there you see some ads for something that you're not about to buy right now. I think that's maybe would be less valued in the long run, unless you kind of somehow find an effective way of catching the consumer at the right time. But I think it depends on it. You may ask the same thing about the advertising agencies and so on. I think that will change, and it's already changing what they do and how important certain functions are. Yeah, did you have?
So you talked about that now there's more emphasis on O than on your predispositions and marketing. But like how to get to a big O in the first place from like stage zero, I feel like it's P and M are still very important and they contribute to growing to an O. Like when you launch say Apple launches a new iWatch or something, they will have a lot of glitz around the day of launch. There'll be big lines which kind of contribute to growing that O. So instead of like, I would say it's become more subtle than just like throwing banners on your face.
You're absolutely right. I mean, they're not going away. Your prior beliefs and knowledge about brand and so on will have some impact into the future. So it's not like each product is a standalone evaluated based on its own merit. That is true. Marketers, as I said, for the kind of products, the O-dependent products that we talked about, I think that's the persuasion becoming less important there in terms of, this is telling you this is a high quality product. So yeah, sure, marketers can create awareness, they can still do a lot of useful things. And obviously what we have stored in our memory, that will continue to have impact. We're talking about relative changes. And I think the big change following the internet is the rise of and I think that people, looking at people who predicted what will happen when the internet, let's say in the mid-90s, kind of became popular, people were debating what it will do to pricing. Will we see lower prices on average because people will compare, or will quality become, there were all kinds of debates. I don't think that people anticipated the sharp rise in all those reviews, experts and users, and their great impact. That, I think, to all those, future, people who specialize in predicting what will happen, I don't think they expected that. Whereas today we know that this may very well be the most, or certainly one of the most important things. The fact that you have reviews, that you have access to. Easy access, quick access to so much information. You know so much about products even before they're introduced. Right. If you think about diffusion of new products, a lot of the diffusion theory was developed based on corn farmers in Iowa, I believe. And if you think about opinion leaders, those kind of concepts, and word of mouth, that was a very different world. For example, one of the key drivers of diffusion, adoption of innovation, was something that innovation experts called observability. To what extent you can observe the innovation or communicate it. Think about how easy it is to do those kind of things on the internet.
But do you think that's where the marketing and that's where contributing to growing that O is where those efforts have gone into now, where you have rock stars endorsing brands or endorsing products?
I think that's much less important. If you think about I forget, when was it that Andrew Agassi was the big spokesperson for Canon? Famously saying, image is everything. You may be too young to remember that. Today it wouldn't have much impact. You see, what's his name, Ashton Kutcher? He's advertising Nikon. I don't think that he's helping Nikon as much as Andrew Agassi helped Canon in the old days. Because, I may like Ashton Kutcher or not. I don't think that I'm going to decide on my next camera on that basis. Yeah.
How do you feel about vocal minorities and the communities where you go in different articles and you see who's the loudest? And I think especially in the tech industry where it's called fanboyism, where you just like Android just because it's Android and anything that Google does, or just because it's Microsoft, anything that Google does you just hate. Do you feel that the community or that mob mentality is in place still?
I think these might be people that you pay close attention to, and I think in certain circles they are very influential. You know, I'm not sure if, I mean, it depends on what kind of products. If you know about products with wide potential market.
Example.
What's that?
I can give you an example. So, for example, our Xbox One release, we had a lot of negative press, and people said it's only the minorities or the small people that are talking on the different articles, but PlayStation 4 is selling well. But I knew it hit a point when my younger siblings are like, yeah, Xbox, you can't play or use games on it, you know, and that was getting to the playgrounds and spreading that way.
You know, I think as you know, with video games, a lot of coolness is certainly important, and what your friends will think about the video games that you play, it's like your music. You know, that's influential. You know, I think that, I mean, it depends which segments. If you know about the hardcore video game players, yeah, they're probably influenced by those kind of things. You know, about your, you know, more kind of average, light to medium user, probably much less so. Yeah.
So, yes, I work in brand strategy here.
Oh, yeah, I'd take it all back.
I was wondering if I could get a job at Stanford. So one of the things that strikes me is that the nature of product has changed as well, right? So the nature of what is the value. I mean, I think that in terms of, you know, if we look at some of the examples that you had there, the microwaves, for example, you know, the nature of product today feels like it's incorporated some of the other P's, right? The other P's have been dragged in, whether you talk about distribution or you talk about packaging. You know, the product experience itself has kind of taken in a lot of the things that previously would have been in the role of marketing. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
I'm not sure I follow what you're saying. So let's say the microwaves, as you know, are still being sold.
Yes.
Not the most exotic product, but they're still being sold. So what has changed?
Well, I think that microwaves, you know, have gone a little bit to the hanger side of the equation, right? There's a commoditization that has happened in microwave.
I don't know. If you buy a microwave, wouldn't you check reviews?
I definitely would.
Right. So it's I'd call that whenever users check reviews, it's on the laptop, the O-dependent side of the continuum.
Right. I think that if we're looking at the products that are on kind of the right side, the decommoditized side, it feels like when
it's not. It's not commoditized.
Okay.
It's not commoditized. I mean, there are certain things that are either not sufficiently important, like, you know, you're not going to check, you know, before buying toothbrush. You're just going to go to the store and get one that looks good. You're not checking any reviews. That's all independent. And maybe colors and promotions and those kind of things, they still affect you.
Right.
So it's not sufficiently important. You know, there's some things that where status. If you are, you know, if you like to buy Louis Vuitton handbags, you're probably not doing it for the quality. I'm not mean to insult the quality of Louis Vuitton handbags. They're probably very good. But you apparently the type of person who likes to be seen with a Louis Vuitton handbag. You're not doing it for the quality, you know, in that regard, the brand is still very important. But I'm not sure I answered your question. Maybe I did.
Well, I mean, certainly when we look at products in our industry, right, which are increasingly becoming a mix of product and service, right? We are, a lot of the things that traditionally were in the domain of marketers, right? Whether it's packaging, the package design, the way that, you know, the box of soap looks on the shelf, or, you know, these are things that now are part of the product development process. They're part of the service development process. And so there's been a shift, I think, in terms of the linearity of an industrialized product and how you then, you know, engineer the product, manufacture it, market it, and sell it. And I think that that's one of the things I think that we're really grappling with in terms of how we appeal to people beyond just brand.
Yeah, no.
Influencing value.
Right. The thing is, as I said, it's hard to predict, and clearly, you know, product development extremely important, and we put that under. I mean, it's covered in the marketing textbook. That's still important and true. What's the contribution of marketing? Usually it has something to do with market research, right? Market research means that you can measure people's preferences and based on that guide the R&D people as to how to develop the product. We're saying, that's becoming much harder to do effectively. I think it has always been kind of a little overestimated, especially if you know about completely new products. But putting that aside, I think market research is not as effective unless you somehow can predict how O will react, which is really hard to do. Yeah.
Okay. So, what is your recommendation for Microsoft, given the O we currently have, on pick a dimension? Pick phones, anything big.
What's that?
Pick a dimension, and what would your recommendation be?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm here just lecturing. That sounds like
Job offer.
but it probably varies by product, and I'm not sure. As I stand here right now, there are a lot of really smart people at Microsoft, from what I hear, and they're thinking about it. So you probably will need to give me at least 5 more minutes.
One of the problems with the O data is its history.
It's what?
It's history of people who have given the reviews based on their prior experience. But in this era of rapid innovation, you're trying to get them to evaluate your most current offering, which people may not have had that much experience with. So is that a challenge in trying to implement this approach?
I mean, isn't it true that today you introduce a new product, instantly you got reviews? Sometimes you get, I don't know if you call them still beta testers, but you got people who are looking at the product beforehand, or they're early adopters. You get reviews in no time and you can look at the most recent reviews, see if they're different than old adopters. I think that if anything, you get much faster feedback.
True. But for service, like the hotel you stay in or the restaurant you want to go to, it's a lot of that is history, and things keep changing, right?
No, that's very true. If you look at this Machiavelli restaurant that I was talking about, it started actually, we tracked their kind of history. They started with a couple of reviews, and then a few more, and then a few more. And, more people try the restaurant. It takes some time, but if you look at the cumulative information, there is a great deal of information there that, tells you a lot about current quality.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, that's a tough choice. Because I see down there, okay, you.
You spoke earlier about the limitations of segmenting, targeting, and...
Can you start over?
Sure. So you spoke about the limitations of segmenting, targeting, and positioning, predetermining those things. So in thinking about product planning and development, I feel like the segmenting, targeting, positioning is important in differentiating your product and making decisions about what features and different things of a product to focus on in order to differentiate from your competitors. So how do you think about product differentiation if you're saying that segmenting, targeting, positioning really isn't something?
What I said is that it is much more difficult to predict which segments will be most important. And if you make the wrong assumptions and you build and promote the product accordingly, you may miss some high potential segments. To some extent, it seems like it's much more risky when the actual demand depends on what other people are saying. Now, maybe you can figure out. I mean, I'm not a great believer in focus groups, for example. So I don't think you can, take 10 people in a room, or do 10 focus groups, and let them have a discussion and figure out based on that who is going to use it. I don't believe that's particularly effective. So I think it's really hard to predict Now, if the product has obvious flaw, yeah, that's something that you may be able to find quickly, but that's not what you're talking about. Yeah, you do need to some extent to decide, and you're looking at what's happening, what kind of products. Let's say you're a successful follower, and you see that everyone likes phones with that replace cameras, that have lots of megapixels. Yeah, that's something you can learn and say, well, that the market, based on the response to other products, appears to appreciate that. Let's include that in our next phone. Yeah, that's I think that makes sense. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to.
I suppose it was just more along the lines of differentiating a product. Like you kind of need to know who your audience is to differentiate from what a competitor might be targeting or who is already using that product.
Right. Okay. So you mean doing things differently?
Yeah, like you have to kind of think in advance for some decisions have to be made before you build the product about what you're building.
Right. I mean, sometimes it is successful. I mentioned the Nintendo Wii. Dominated the market for like 3 years because they came up with the great idea, not based on market research, just someone came up with that idea, and you don't know how many other things they tried that didn't work out. But you talk about something in terms of general managerial practice. Do some research, figure out on what we want to differentiate. If you're lucky, it may work out. If you look at trends, it's becoming less effective.
Thank you so much, Itamar.